I booked an Airbnb with my friend for a short weekend trip out of the city. We wanted something quiet, somewhere in the hills but not too far from the main road. I found a small 2-bedroom house listed by an older host. The pictures showed a plain but cozy place. A small living room, a kitchen, and a deck that overlooked a steep drop full of trees. The reviews were average, nothing alarming, just some people saying it was a little isolated. That was exactly what we wanted. We drove there on a Friday evening. The road wound through narrow turns and scattered houses that became less frequent the higher we went. By the time we reached the address, the sun was almost gone. The Airbnb sat at the end of a gravel driveway that curved uphill, surrounded by thick trees on both sides. The house was small, single-story, the paint slightly faded. A weak porch light flickered as we carried our bags inside. The air inside smelled faintly damp, like wood that hadn't been aired out in a while. The floor creaked every time we stepped on it. There was a narrow hallway that led to 2 bedrooms, a bathroom between them, and the living area opened into the kitchen. Everything was clean but old, the kind of place where the furniture didn't match and every drawer stuck halfway when you tried to open it. We unpacked, then went out on the deck for a while. It was quiet, only the sound of crickets and wind pushing through the trees. The deck railing overlooked a slope that fell into a dark line of woods. From up there, it looked peaceful, but there was something about the trees that made me uneasy. They were packed tight, the kind that blocked out light even in the day. That night, we went to bed early. My friend took the bedroom near the front of the house, and I took the one closer to the back deck. It was cold, so I pulled the blanket up and left the small lamp on. The house had thin walls. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge and the wind outside brushing against the siding. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a dull noise, a slow dragging sound somewhere outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. At first, I thought it was an animal. I stayed still, listening. The sound continued for maybe a minute, then stopped completely. I waited, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. After a while, I fell back asleep. In the morning, my friend looked tired. He said he hadn't slept much but didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. We spent the day exploring the nearby town, then came back before sunset. The driveway was so narrow we had to reverse carefully every time we left. As we pulled in that evening, I noticed something odd. Small tire marks going off the edge of the gravel near the trees, like another vehicle had turned in there and backed out. I assumed maybe the host or a neighbor came by, though there were no other houses immediately nearby. Inside, the air felt colder than before, even though the windows were closed. I checked the thermostat, but it didn't seem to be working properly. We decided to use extra blankets instead of messing with it. Later that night, I stayed up scrolling through my phone while my friend went to bed. Around midnight, I heard the same dragging sound again. This time it was closer, like it was coming from below the deck. It stopped, then a few seconds later came a faint thud, like wood being stepped on. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps moving across the deck boards. I turned off the lamp, held my breath, and stared toward the thin curtains that covered the glass door to the deck. The steps stopped right outside the door. There was a long silence, then a soft creak, like weight shifting on the boards. I didn't move. After maybe half a minute, the sound started again. Slow steps moving away, back toward the trees. I waited for a long time before I got up. I didn't want to wake my friend or seem paranoid, so I just checked the door to make sure it was locked, then went back to bed. My heart was still pounding. The next morning, I went out to look at the deck. There were faint shoe prints near the railing, not barefoot, but the kind made by worn-out sneakers. The pattern looked adult-sized. The boards were slightly dusty, so the prints were clear. They led to the edge of the deck and stopped. I followed them to the stairs and saw faint impressions in the dirt leading into the trees. I showed my friend. He looked uneasy but brushed it off. saying maybe the host came by to check something. I wasn't convinced. The footprints were too close to the bedroom window. We decided to stay one more night since it was already paid for, but I didn't relax the whole day. I kept looking at the trees from the deck, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing ever moved, though sometimes I thought I saw a bit of color between the trunks, like a jacket or a shirt. Then it would vanish. When darkness fell, I locked every window and door, checked them twice. My friend went to sleep earlier than me, exhausted. I sat on the couch with my phone light dimmed, just scrolling aimlessly to distract myself. Around 1:30, I heard it again, the dragging sound. It was faint but steady, coming from the same direction as before. Then the steps. This time, they didn't stop at the deck. They came all the way to the wall near my friend's room. I could hear the boards flexing under the weight. I turned off my phone light and waited. My chest felt tight. The footsteps stayed near the wall, then slowly circled around the deck toward the sliding glass door. I was facing it now. The curtain shifted slightly, just the fabric moving inward a bit, like air pressure changed or someone brushed against it from outside. Then silence again. A long, heavy silence. I stayed like that for almost an hour before I dared to move. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I went outside immediately. The prints were deeper this time, fresher, like someone had been there just before sunrise. But what unsettled me most was what I found near the bottom of the deck stairs. A crushed cigarette, but still smelling faintly of smoke. Neither of us smoked. That was enough. We packed up fast and left that morning. The drive down the hill felt endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way, half expecting to see someone following. When we got home, I went through the listing again. I decided to message the host just to ask if anyone had been on the property, maybe maintenance or inspection. The host replied a few hours later saying no one had been there since we checked in, and that they lived several hours away. Out of curiosity, I looked through the reviews again. I noticed one I hadn't paid attention to before, a short comment buried among others. It said something about someone outside at night, but ended with might have been a neighbor. The host had replied that the area was safe and sometimes locals used the nearby trail. I checked Google Maps again to see the surrounding area. There was no trail behind the property, just thick woods that stretched for miles. For days after coming back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound outside my apartment made me tense. My friend didn't talk about it either, but I knew he felt the same. A week later, I decided to check the Airbnb listing again. Maybe leave my own review warning others. But when I opened the page, it said, "This listing is no longer available." It was gone completely, as if it had never existed. I never found out who was out there that night. Maybe it was someone who used to live in that house, maybe a local who watched guests for fun, maybe something worse. But what still bothers me most is how deliberate those footsteps sounded. Slow, patient, like the person knew exactly where we were inside. Ever since then, whenever I travel, I can't fall asleep in strange places. I keep checking every window, every lock, because I know how easily someone can stand just outside, listening, waiting, without ever making a sound loud enough for anyone else to notice. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and quiet. That was all I wanted. A few days away from noise, from people, from everything. The listing showed a small house on the edge of a small town, surrounded by open fields, a bit isolated but not too far from a main road. The pictures made it look simple: white walls, wooden floors, basic furniture. Nothing fancy, but clean. The host had good reviews, though none of them said much beyond short things like nice stay or peaceful place. I didn't think much of that at the time. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road to the house was long and narrow, cutting through tall dry grass that leaned inward as if trying to swallow it. The gravel crunched under my tires the whole way. When I reached the place, there were no nearby houses in sight. Just that one small building sitting under a single tree with a rusted swing hanging from one of its branches. The house looked exactly like the photos but older, like the pictures had been taken years ago. The paint was chipped on the sides, the wooden steps creaked when I walked up, and the porch had a layer of dust like nobody had used it in weeks. Inside, it smelled like wood and cleaning products. There was a single hallway that led to a small living room and a kitchen on the right, then a short corridor to the bedroom and bathroom on the left. Everything was plain. A couch, a small TV, a wooden dining table, a half-empty bookshelf. I dropped my bag by the couch and looked around. It wasn't cozy, but it was quiet, and that was all I needed. After unpacking, I checked the doors and windows. The locks were old but worked fine. The back door opened to a small patch of overgrown grass with a rusted metal chair sitting there like someone used to sit out and smoke. Beyond that was just more empty land, stretching out toward a thin line of trees far in the distance. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal, watched a bit of TV, and went to bed early. The silence around the place was strange though. I live in the city, so I'm used to distant car sounds, people, or something going on in the background. Out there, it was nothing but wind. I tried to ignore it, but I kept noticing how my own breathing felt too loud in that kind of quiet. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft sound. Not loud, but sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. It was a single creak from the floorboards, like someone had stepped once near the hallway. I stayed still for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was the wood expanding or cooling down. After a minute, I heard another faint noise, something brushing lightly against the wall. Came from the living room direction. I sat up and listened. The house was silent again. I stayed like that for a long time, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. I eventually laid back down, staring at the dim outline of the window until sleep came back slowly. In the morning, I checked the doors. Both front and back were locked just how I left them. I figured maybe I was just not used to the noises of an old house in the middle of nowhere. I went for a short walk down the gravel road, saw a few fields and an old fence that looked like it had been left to rot for years. There wasn't much around. No other houses within sight, no vehicles passing by. It felt oddly disconnected, like I was in some forgotten pocket of land. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. I was sitting by the kitchen window drinking coffee when I saw what looked like tire marks going across the side of the property. Faint tracks that curved toward the back of the house. I hadn't noticed them when I arrived. I walked outside and followed them. They led toward the grass behind the house and faded into the dirt a few meters away. There were no footprints, just those uneven tire marks, like from a small car or maybe an ATV. They didn't go anywhere specific, just looped around and stopped. I thought maybe the owner came by at some point before I checked in. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every sound in the house felt sharper now. I heard what I thought was the same soft creak again around midnight, somewhere near the hallway. I lay still, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard a slow, dragging sound, faint but steady, like something light being pulled across the floor. It stopped after a few seconds. I turned on my phone's flashlight and looked toward the door. Nothing. When morning came, I checked the floors again. No marks, nothing moved. The only thing I noticed was that the back door, which I knew I locked, was slightly ajar. Just a few inches. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to remember if maybe I had left it open without realizing. But I was sure I hadn't. I started feeling uneasy after that. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something outside. The feeling that someone had been in there while I was asleep wouldn't leave me. I decided to set my phone to record during the night, just audio, to see if I could catch any sounds. The next night was restless. I woke up twice, both times to silence so deep it made me feel trapped. I kept waiting to hear the creak again, but nothing happened. When morning came, I checked the recording. For hours, there was nothing but low hums from the fridge and faint wind outside. Then, around 3:18 a.m., there was a soft click. The same kind of sound a door latch makes when it opens slowly. A few seconds later came a faint shuffle of movement, like someone taking careful steps on the floor. It went on for maybe 20 seconds before stopping completely. I sat there replaying that part over and over. I checked both doors again, both locked. The windows were shut. I couldn't find any signs of forced entry, but that recording made it clear. Someone had been inside. That evening I stayed alert. I didn't go to bed early. I kept the lights off but sat on the couch in the dark, looking toward the hallway. I had a heavy flashlight in my hand, just in case. Hours passed without anything happening. Around 2:30, I started getting tired. Then, from somewhere near the kitchen, I heard the soft creak again. This time I knew it wasn't the house. I could feel the weight of it, the kind that only happens when someone steps slowly, trying not to make noise. I held my breath and waited. The sound came again, closer, one step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I stayed perfectly still. Then the sound stopped, completely. After a long silence, I heard something faint. A slow exhale, not mine, coming from near the corner of the living room. That was it for me. I turned on the flashlight and rushed toward the front door, grabbed my keys and got into my car. I didn't even look back. I drove straight down that gravel road, dust flying behind me, not stopping until I reached the main road miles away. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I called the host through the app, but no one picked up. I sent a message saying I was leaving early because something wasn't right in that house. I didn't get a reply that day. Later, after I got home, I checked the listing again out of curiosity. It was gone, removed completely like it never existed. I tried to search the host's profile and that was gone too. I contacted Airbnb support, but all they said was that the listing had been deactivated. For a while, I tried to put it behind me, but a week later, I got a message from an unknown number. No name, no text, just a single photo attached. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me sleeping in that bed, same room, same blanket, taken from the angle of the doorway. The image had a faint shadow in the bottom corner, like someone holding the camera close to the doorframe. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., 1 minute before the door opened in the recording. That's when I realized whoever was inside that house wasn't just passing through. They had been watching. Maybe they'd been doing it to everyone who stayed there, taking pictures while they slept, moving silently in the dark. I deleted the number, changed mine, and moved apartments soon after. But sometimes, when I'm half asleep at night, I still think I hear that soft creak. One quiet step on old wooden floors, and it makes me open my eyes just to make sure no one's standing in the doorway. We booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and only a few hours from home. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small guest unit behind a main house in a quiet suburban area. The photos made it look cozy and simple, with a little porch, white curtains, and a gravel path leading up from the driveway. It said it was rustic but modern, which was perfect for a weekend getaway on a budget. The host had good reviews, and everything about the listing looked safe enough. When we arrived, it was late afternoon. The main house was larger than I expected, painted a faded blue, with peeling shutters and an old wooden fence that separated it from the back unit. The guest house sat behind a few trees and shrubs, partly hidden. It was smaller in person and older too. The siding was cracked in a few places, and the steps creaked when we walked up them. Still, it was clean inside. There was a faint smell of lemon cleaner and old wood. The layout was simple. One main room with a bed, a couch, a small kitchen, and a door that led to a bathroom barely big enough to stand in. The windows were covered with white blinds, and you could see the outline of the main house through them if you stood in the right spot. The host wasn't around when we got there, just a lockbox with the key. The note on the counter said to text if we needed anything. The first day went by quietly. We went out to eat, came back before sunset, and just watched a movie on the laptop. The area was peaceful. The night air was cool, and you could hear crickets. I remember how still everything felt around 11 p.m. when the lights in the main house went out. It gave the impression we were the only ones awake in the whole neighborhood. Around midnight, I started hearing something outside. It was slow, rhythmic footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone walking their dog, or maybe the host checking around the property. But the sound didn't move past the unit. Stayed nearby, pacing just outside the front door. The gravel crunched lightly with every few steps. I stood still for a moment, listening. Then I went over to the window and slightly lifted one of the blinds. There was a man standing near the door. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there facing the unit. The porch light barely reached him, but I could see enough. He was wearing dark clothes and a cap. His posture was stiff, and his head was slightly tilted down, like he was focused on the door. He didn't move. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. I stepped back quietly and my stomach felt tight. The space felt smaller suddenly, like the air got heavier. I locked the door and checked the back window just in case. I didn't see him anywhere else. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises outside, gravel shifting, a light scrape near the porch railing. Every sound made me sit up, listening. By morning, when sunlight finally filled the room, it looked normal again. The yard was empty. There were no footprints that I could see in the dirt, no sign of anyone being there. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was nothing serious. Maybe just a random person who wandered too close. The property wasn't fenced in. Could have been anyone. We went into town, tried to forget about it, came back later than usual that evening. Everything seemed calm. That night, it started again. Around the same time, close to midnight, I heard something outside. This time it was slower, heavier. The sound of someone walking directly up to the porch. Then silence. I turned off the small lamp near the bed so the inside wouldn't be visible through the blinds. The light from the street lamp barely touched the yard, but I could make out movement through the thin slats. The same man was there. He was closer this time, standing right in front of the door. His head was angled toward the handle. His shoulders moved slightly, like he was breathing hard or trying to keep quiet. Then I heard it, a faint metallic sound. The doorknob moved, slowly like he was testing it. Then again, harder this time. The metal clicked quietly, followed by the sound of something brushing against the wood, like a finger dragging near the edge. My whole body went cold. I just stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. My pulse was so loud I could hear it in my ears. The sound of the knob stopped after a few seconds, but he didn't leave. He stood there. I could see his shadow stretching across the blinds, perfectly still. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound of slow footsteps began again, fading toward the trees behind the unit. Neither of us slept that night. We packed a few of our things and stayed awake until sunrise. When light came through the windows, it felt safer, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. There was something wrong about how calm he had been, how deliberate every movement seemed. We left as soon as it was light enough to drive. I didn't even bother checking out properly or messaging the host right away. We just got in the car and went. I didn't relax until we were miles away. Later that afternoon, when I finally calmed down, I checked the Airbnb app. I sent the host a message explaining what happened, describing the man I saw both nights. The reply came quickly, short and dismissive, saying it was probably just a local neighbor who sometimes wanders around, and that there was nothing to worry about. It didn't make sense. The man didn't look like someone casually walking by. He had stood there like he knew exactly who was inside and what time to show up. I went back through the reviews. Most were old and positive, but when I scrolled further down, I started seeing a few that had been hidden under critical reviews. People had written about strange noises at night. One mentioned seeing someone standing outside the unit near the door, staring. Another said something about a man in dark clothes trying the doorknob one night. One review mentioned that the host used to rent the guest house long-term to a man who refused to leave after being evicted. The review said he still hung around the property sometimes, even after the host listed the place online. The host had replied to that one too, calling it a misunderstanding. I realized then that it all lined up. Whoever that man was, he probably never really left. He was still there, living somewhere close, maybe even behind the trees or in one of those small sheds we hadn't noticed. He wasn't a random stranger. He knew the property. He had been there before. A few days later, I checked the listing again to see if anyone else had written about it. The listing was gone, completely removed. The host's profile still existed but had no active properties. That was months ago, but I still think about it sometimes. About how close he was to the door. About how quiet it was when he tried the handle, like he'd done it before and knew exactly how much pressure to use. The idea that someone could just stand there in the dark, watching, knowing that you're on the other side, too scared to move. It sticks with you. Every time I rent a place now, I check everything. The locks, the windows, the surroundings. I never stay in a unit behind another house anymore, because I still can't shake the thought that the man might still be there, pacing quietly outside some other guest's door, waiting for another weekend booking, another couple to arrive, thinking they've found a cheap place to stay. I booked an Airbnb in a small rural area of northern Michigan. I wanted to be alone for a few days, just to get away from the city, the noise, and people. The listing was for a converted garage beside a larger house, but the host said the main house was empty and that guests had the whole property to themselves. The photos showed a small, neat space with a single bed, a kitchenette, and a big sliding door that opened into a wide backyard leading to a stretch of woods. It looked simple and quiet, exactly what I needed. When I got there, the sun was starting to set. The road that led to the property was narrow, with tall grass brushing the sides of my car. The garage-turned-guest house looked smaller than in the photos. The paint was peeling near the roof, and there was a faint musty smell when I opened the door. Inside, everything was clean enough, but it had that feeling of a place that hasn't been used in a while. Air a little stale, floorboards a bit uneven. The first few hours were fine. I unpacked, set up my laptop, and heated up some food I brought along. There was no Wi-Fi and almost no cell service, which was strange but not unexpected that far out. I stepped outside for a bit after dark, just to breathe in the quiet. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the faint hum of crickets. It was almost too quiet. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, according to the host's directions. I went to bed around 11 p.m. The bed was right beside the sliding glass door that faced the backyard. There was a curtain, but it was thin enough that I could still see the dark outline of the yard beyond it. The moonlight made a pale shape through the curtain, and for a while I just watched it while lying in bed trying to relax. Then I heard something, soft, steady footsteps in the grass. They weren't close, but I could hear the crunch of dry leaves and the shift of weight on the ground. They moved slowly, pausing for a few seconds between steps. I froze, trying to listen harder. The steps stopped somewhere near the tree line. Then nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a stray dog. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I stayed awake for another hour, just listening. No more sounds came, and eventually I fell asleep. In the morning, I tried not to think about it. I went outside to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The grass behind the guest house was wet from dew, and near the edge of the trees, I noticed faint impressions in the dirt. Long, narrow footprints. Not from boots, not from animals. They looked like regular shoes. I crouched down, staring at them for a long time, my stomach tightening. The prints went into the trees and disappeared. I stood there for a few minutes trying to reason it out. Maybe the host came by to check something. Maybe there was a hiker who passed through by mistake. I looked toward the main house, which stood about 50 feet away. It was dark inside, windows covered with blinds. I had assumed no one was there, but for a second, I thought I saw one of the blinds slightly tilted, like someone had looked through it. When I blinked, it looked normal again. I went back inside, locked the sliding door, and tried to focus on reading. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. That night, I checked every lock twice. The wind picked up after midnight, and I could hear branches scraping against the side of the building. It was hard to sleep with all the little noises. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was something metallic, faint but clear. A small click from the side of the room. The noise came again. I turned my head slowly and saw that the handle of the sliding door was trembling slightly, like someone was gently testing it from outside. I lay there completely still, every muscle frozen. The handle moved again, just a slow, deliberate motion, like someone trying not to make noise. Then it stopped. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. I didn't move the curtain to look. I didn't want to see. When morning came, I finally gathered enough courage to go outside. The ground near the door had marks again. Clear shoe prints pointing toward the woods. The door itself had faint smudges on the glass, like fingerprints. I felt sick. I decided to drive into town just to be around people for a while. I told myself I'd only stay one more night, then leave early. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. It felt too strange to explain. When I came back that afternoon, the air felt heavier. The woods behind the property looked darker even though the sun was still up. I sat on the porch steps for a while, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Before it got dark, I placed an old chair against the sliding door and stacked a few metal utensils on top, thinking they'd make noise if the door moved. I kept the lights off so it would look like I wasn't home. I sat on the bed in silence, listening. It must have been around 11 when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and dragging, moving along the side of the building. Then came the faint sound of breathing. Not loud, but close enough that I could hear it through the thin wall. The air felt like it had frozen. I couldn't move. I just stared at the door, waiting. The footsteps shifted toward the front of the house, then back again like whoever it was circling it. The sound of the wind and the faint rustle of grass mixed together, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining it all. But then, the utensils clattered loudly to the floor. The chair tipped slightly. The door had moved. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my car keys, slipped on my shoes, and went straight to the door on the opposite side of the building. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. The second I was outside, I ran straight to my car, turned on the headlights, and saw movement. Someone running into the trees, just a flash of dark clothing before they disappeared. I drove off without looking back. I didn't even stop to grab my bag. My heart was pounding the entire way down that empty road, the rearview mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. When I got to town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for almost an hour, trying to calm down. I finally sent a message to the Airbnb host, saying that someone had been outside the unit at night and that I was leaving early. They didn't respond until the next day, saying they were sorry to hear that and that they'd checked the property. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the listing again. It was gone, completely removed. I tried to find the host's profile. It had been deleted too. Weeks passed, and I kept thinking about what I saw that night. That brief moment when the headlights caught someone running. The way they moved wasn't like they were surprised. It looked practiced, like they had done it before. I still wonder how many guests had stayed there before me, sleeping with that thin curtain beside their bed, never knowing that someone was walking in the yard at night, testing the door handle, waiting for the right moment. The part that stays with me most is something I noticed only after the fact. In one of the photos from the Airbnb listing, there had been a mirror on the wall beside the bed. I remembered seeing it when I booked, but it wasn't there when I arrived. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I looked back at the pictures before the listing was deleted, I saw something in that mirror's reflection. A faint figure standing by the sliding door, halfway hidden behind the curtain. Now I keep wondering if that was the host or someone else entirely. Whoever it was, they knew exactly how close to stand to the glass without making a sound. I booked a small Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood outside a small town in Oregon. The photos showed a neat one-bedroom house with a little porch and a big backyard surrounded by a wooden fence. It looked perfect for a week alone to focus on some writing and just clear my head. I had been working long hours for months, and I needed some time away from the noise and people. The reviews were good, Nothing suspicious, mostly people saying it was peaceful, clean, and private. That's what I wanted, privacy. The drive there was calm. It was early evening when I arrived, the sky dimming, a light drizzle falling. The street was lined with old houses, spaced far apart. The Airbnb stood at the end, right beside a small patch of woods. It looked older in person than in the photos. Paint a little chipped, windows a bit cloudy. The backyard stretched out farther than I expected, and the trees behind it looked thick, dark, and overgrown. Inside, everything seemed fine at first. The living room was small but cozy. There was a big couch, a small TV, a table with a vase of fake flowers, and a bookshelf filled with random paperbacks. The kitchen smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. The bedroom was simple. A queen bed, 2 nightstands, and 1 big window facing the backyard. The blinds were open, and through them I could see the fence, then the black line of trees beyond it. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of your own breath. I unpacked slowly, turned on a few lights, and made some instant noodles for dinner. I felt fine for a while. The heater worked, and the place felt warm and safe. When night fell, I shut the blinds, locked the doors, and sat down to read. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing something faint from the backyard. It was a kind of repetitive sound, like a slow squeak, faint but steady. It reminded me of a loose gate hinge swinging in the wind. I figured it was the fence or maybe a branch. I tried to ignore it, but it went on for a long time. Eventually, I went to the window and looked out. I could barely see anything. The yard light was dim and yellow, barely reaching the fence. The sound stopped the second I got near the window. I stood there for a while, waiting, but it didn't return. I went back to bed, brushed it off, and tried to sleep. The next morning was calm. I made coffee, went outside to sit on the porch, and took a better look at the yard. The fence gate at the far end was swinging slightly in the breeze. That was probably what I heard. I walked over and noticed the latch was loose. It didn't close properly. I fixed it with a small piece of wire I found in the shed beside the house. There was nothing strange, just tools, an old lawnmower, and some garden supplies. The rest of the day went quietly. I worked on my laptop, made some food, took a short walk down the street. No one else seemed to be around. Most of the houses looked empty, maybe vacation homes. By evening, the drizzle started again, and fog began to form around the trees behind the fence. The woods looked thicker than I remembered. That night, I started hearing the squeaking again. It was softer this time, almost like it was farther away. I stayed on the couch, pretending not to notice. Then there was another sound, different, lower, like footsteps through wet grass. I froze. The sound came from the backyard. It stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or deer, something common. Still, I got up and turned off the lights, standing near the window in the dark. I could barely make out shapes, but I thought I saw something. Just a slight movement near the fence, like someone stepping out of view. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small creak in the house made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off, but even in sleep, I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to check the backyard properly. The grass was wet, but near the middle, where it turned to soft dirt, I saw something that stopped me. There were footprints, human footprints, leading from the fence toward the house. The prints stopped just a few feet from the bedroom window, right below where I had been sleeping. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were old. Maybe a delivery person or maintenance worker came by, but they looked fresh. The edges were clear, not softened by rain. I walked to the fence and checked the latch I had wired shut the day before. It was undone. The wire was still there, but twisted apart, like someone had pulled it off carefully. That made my hands shake. I went back inside and double-checked every door and window. Everything was locked. Nothing looked disturbed inside. Still, the idea that someone had walked through the yard in the night, right up to my window, made my skin crawl. I thought about leaving right then, but I convinced myself to stay one more night. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the host came by and forgot to mention it. Maybe it was kids messing around. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. I turned on every light in the house. I sat on the couch, listening. The rain started again, tapping against the windows. Then, around midnight, I heard a new sound, soft and irregular, like small thumps against the side of the house. Came from the back wall near the bedroom. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint it. It would happen once, then stop, then again a few minutes later. When I finally worked up the nerve to go check, I turned off the lights and peeked through the blinds. First, I saw nothing. The fog was thick, and the yard light flickered slightly. Then I saw it. A figure standing near the fence, motionless. Not close, but visible enough to tell it was a person. My heart started pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The figure didn't move, just stood there facing the house. I backed away from the window slowly. I didn't want to make a sound. I went to the front door, checking the lock again, then to the kitchen to grab the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron pan. I sat down in the living room and waited. Every few minutes, I checked the window. The figure was gone after a while, but I didn't believe they had really left. The next few hours dragged on like days. Every small noise made my body tense. At some point, I must have dozed off sitting up because I woke to faint light coming through the blinds. It was morning. When I stepped outside, I saw more footprints in the wet grass. They were closer to the house this time. One set stopped directly below the living room window where I had been sitting. There was also something else. On the side of the house, under the window, I noticed scratches in the wood siding. Long, uneven marks like someone had scraped a tool or knife against it. That was it. I packed everything, locked the doors, and got in the car. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. When I drove off, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin shrink into the distance, the fog swallowing it. I didn't contact the host right away. I drove for nearly 2 hours before stopping at a rest area. I sat there trying to process what had happened. Finally, I messaged the host, telling them someone had been in the yard at night and that I was leaving early. They replied hours later, saying no one was supposed to be there and apologizing for the disturbance. They refunded me 1 night's stay. That was it. A week later, out of curiosity, I checked the Airbnb listing again. The photos were gone, replaced with a temporarily unavailable notice. A few reviews had been deleted too. I found one old review that I hadn't noticed before. It mentioned strange noises at night and footsteps outside. Now, months later, I still think about that figure standing by the fence. I wonder how long they had been coming into that yard. Maybe they'd been watching every guest who stayed there. Maybe they lived in those woods, slipping in at night when the lights went out. What still haunts me most is the scratches on the siding. They weren't random. They were straight, deliberate lines, almost even right beneath the windows, like someone marking the places where people sleep. I booked a small Airbnb cabin in upstate New York for a week in late October. It was supposed to be quiet and isolated, surrounded by woods and a small lake nearby. The photos showed a neat little cabin with a deck, a small fire pit, and an old wooden dock that reached into the lake. I wanted a break from everything. No noise, no traffic, no people. I work in a cramped office, spend most days staring at screens, and that trip felt like a way to breathe again. The drive up there took around 5 hours. The last stretch was all narrow dirt roads twisting through dense trees. The GPS lost signal halfway, so I followed the host's directions written in the booking message. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked between pines, with faded paint and moss growing on the roof. It looked older than it did in the photos. The place was quiet except for the wind brushing through the leaves. There were no neighbors in sight, no other cabins, just that one standing in the middle of the woods. The key was in a small lockbox by the door. The air inside smelled faintly of pine and dust. It was clean enough but felt old, like no one had stayed there for a while. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with big windows facing the lake. The view was actually beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the dull gray sky. The first day was calm. I unpacked, made some food, and took a short walk along the lake. I didn't see anyone. No boats, no cars, not even birds after sunset. When night came, it got incredibly dark. I had never experienced that kind of blackness before. No streetlights, no glow from other houses, just complete darkness pressing against the windows. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the woods. Every small sound stood out. The creaking of the floorboards, the occasional knock from the wind, branches scraping against the roof. It was hard to sleep. Around midnight, I heard something that didn't sound like wind. It was faint, like a soft crunch of leaves outside the bedroom window. Then silence. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon or something similar. I fell asleep eventually, though it wasn't deep sleep. The next morning, I made coffee and decided to sit on the deck. That's when I noticed footprints in the dirt path near the side of the cabin. They were clear shoe prints, not animal tracks. They led around the side of the cabin toward the trees and disappeared into the woods. The dirt was still slightly damp from last night's rain, which meant those prints were fresh. I stood there staring for a while, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was from a hiker passing by. Maybe someone from maintenance came earlier in the morning. But I didn't hear anyone. I walked around the cabin, checking if there was anything else. One of the small basement windows looked like it had smudges on the glass, like someone had touched it. That made me uneasy. I went back inside and locked all the windows, just in case. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read, cooked, and took a short nap. By late afternoon, fog started creeping in from the lake, rolling through the trees until it swallowed the entire view. It was eerie but kind of peaceful. I turned on the small heater in the living room, listened to the low hum it made, and tried not to think about the footprints. That night, though, things felt different. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lights to sleep, and again, the darkness felt heavier than before. I lay in bed listening, trying to ignore every sound. But sometime later, maybe an hour or two, I woke up because of a faint thud from somewhere inside the cabin. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to jolt me awake. I stayed still for a few minutes, trying to hear it again. Then came another sound, something like a light shuffle on the wooden floor. My heart was pounding hard. I strained my ears, but everything went quiet. I thought maybe it was the heater making noises, or maybe I imagined it half asleep. Still, I couldn't go back to sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the doorway, until the faint blue light of dawn seeped in through the curtains. When I finally got up, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The small rug by the front door was slightly out of place, like it had been moved, and the door itself had faint smudges near the handle, like someone had touched it with dirty hands. I checked the lock. It was still turned, but the deadbolt had a tiny scratch around it, like someone had tried to wiggle it. That day, I couldn't relax. Every sound made me flinch. I kept walking around the cabin, checking the windows and the back door. I debated leaving early, but part of me thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the noises were from the wind, maybe the prints were old, maybe I was just being paranoid in an isolated place. By evening, I decided to set up a small trap. Not really a trap, but just to see if anyone came near. I placed an empty glass bottle upright just behind the front door and a small piece of paper across the top. If anyone opened it during the night, the bottle would tip or the paper would fall. It was stupid, but it gave me some small sense of control. That night, I barely slept again. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a very soft sound. A creak, slow and deliberate, like a footstep on old wood, came from near the living room. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it went quiet. No more footsteps, no sound at all after that. When morning came, sunlight filled the cabin. Everything looked normal at first. I went to check the bottle. It was on its side. The paper was crumpled near the door. The lock was still turned, but there was no doubt that someone had been inside. I packed my bag immediately. I didn't even bother making breakfast. Before I left, I did one last check around the cabin. Behind the sofa, I found a small object. One of my own socks, dirty, like it had been dropped there. I knew for a fact it had been in my bag. That was the final proof I needed. When I got outside, I noticed more footprints leading away from the cabin, toward the trees like before. But this time there were two sets, one going toward the woods, one coming from them. I drove out of there as fast as I could. The dirt road seemed endless. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt a mix of relief and nausea. I stopped at a gas station miles away just to catch my breath. Later, I messaged the Airbnb host, telling them what happened, about the footprints and the sounds. They responded hours later saying they'd look into it. I never heard anything else from them. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't want any more contact. Weeks later, I checked the listing again. It was gone, removed completely, no trace of it on the site. To this day, I keep thinking about that night. The creak of the floor, the soft shuffle, the bottle knocked over. Someone was in that cabin while I was sleeping. Someone who probably watched me from the woods, waiting until I turned off the lights. I still don't know what they wanted or how long they'd been there. Every time I think about that place, I picture the footprints fading into the trees and wonder if whoever made them had been staying there all along, just not through Airbnb. I booked an Airbnb in a small coastal town for a week, hoping to get away from the city and finish some work in peace. The photos looked simple, an old one-bedroom unit attached to a larger house, about 10 minutes from the beach. It had a private entrance, a small kitchen, and a yard surrounded by tall wooden fencing. The reviews were mostly positive. People mentioned the place being quiet and private, though a few mentioned hearing noises at night. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I arrived, the air smelled of salt and damp grass. The main house was old, painted white but faded almost gray, with rust on the hinges of the gates. The small unit I rented sat behind it, separated by a narrow pathway lined with weeds and gravel. The host had left the key in a lockbox by the door. Everything looked exactly like the pictures, small, tidy, but worn down. The furniture was plain and mismatched, a thin couch against the wall, a wobbly table with two chairs, a bed with squeaky springs. The place had one large window that faced the backyard. The wooden fence behind it was tall enough that I couldn't see anything beyond it, just the tops of some trees and a bit of sky. It gave the yard an odd closed-in feeling, like being boxed in. There was a single motion light above the back door that flickered when it turned on. That first evening, I unpacked and went out for groceries. When I got back, it was already dark. The motion light didn't come on right away, so I had to use my phone's flashlight to find the keyhole. Inside, the air was warm and still, but I felt uneasy for no reason I could explain. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound, the creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, feel louder than it should. I worked late that night, sitting at the table with my laptop. Around midnight, I heard a faint thump from outside. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough that I noticed. It came again, softer this time, from near the fence. I froze, listening carefully. Then there was nothing, just the usual sound of distant waves and the occasional car passing on the main road. I assumed it was something small, like a branch falling or maybe a raccoon. The next morning, I went outside to check the yard. The ground was mostly dirt and sand, but near the fence, I noticed faint marks, shoe prints. Not animal tracks, but actual shoes. They weren't mine. They were bigger, the sole pattern different, like heavy work boots. The prints were near the fence, close enough that whoever made them had been standing right behind it, facing the window. The fence was tall, around 7 feet, but old and uneven. Some of the boards were warped, and there were gaps big enough to see through if someone pressed an eye against them. I stared at it for a while, then told myself maybe someone had been fixing something in the yard before I arrived. Still, it bothered me. That night, I kept the curtains drawn. I didn't want to look out the window. I left the motion light on just in case. I worked again until late, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in. Around 1 a.m., I heard the same sound. A dull, dragging noise along the fence, slow and uneven. I turned off my laptop screen and sat still, straining to hear. The dragging stopped, then came a faint creak of wood, like one of the fence boards being pressed or shifted. I waited. The motion light outside flickered on, casting a weak white glow through the curtains. I didn't move. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was close. The kind of sound a person makes when they're standing still just outside the window. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then the motion light flicked off again, and the silence returned. The next morning, I found new prints in the dirt, fresh, deeper, leading directly to the back door. I also noticed the gate latch on the side fence had been lifted. It was one of those simple metal hooks that hang loosely into a loop, the kind that can't come undone easily from the wind. Someone had moved it. I felt a dull pressure in my chest that didn't go away. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was fine, at least on the inside. I thought about leaving early, but it was already paid for, and part of me didn't want to admit I was scared over something that might be nothing. The third night, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every noise made me look up. Around midnight, I turned off all the lights, thinking maybe if it was an animal or someone watching, they'd lose interest if the place looked empty. I lay in bed, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard the motion light click on again. The thin line of light under the curtain glowed faintly against the floor. Then there was a sound, slow footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the yard side. The boards of the fence creaked faintly. The footsteps stopped right outside the window. I could hear breathing again, slow and heavy. Then came a faint tapping sound, metallic and irregular, like someone lightly hitting the glass with something small.
Top,
Pause.
top, top.
My whole body went tense. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling, counting each second in my head. The tapping stopped. The breathing didn't. It stayed for another minute, then slowly faded, replaced by the sound of the motion light clicking off again. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally came, I went outside again. This time, there were scuff marks on the siding below the window, like someone had pressed a shoe against it to get a better angle. I checked the fence, and that's when I saw it. A small, loose board near the corner that had been pulled back slightly. It wasn't broken, just bent inward enough that someone could peek through. I packed most of my stuff that morning, but told myself I'd leave the next day to avoid wasting another night's payment. I was still trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That evening, I didn't turn on the lights at all. I sat quietly in the dark, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the motion light again. My heart started pounding before I even looked up. Through the narrow slit in the curtain, I could see a faint shape, someone standing at the edge of the yard. The outline was faint but unmistakable. A tall figure still facing the window. They didn't move, not for a long time, just stood there, half in shadow, half in the dim glow of the motion light. Then, slowly, they stepped backward until they disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my bag and left everything else behind. I didn't even turn on the lights. I drove off barefoot, my shoes still by the door. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station several miles away, where I stayed in the car until morning. The next day, I went back with the police to get my things. They checked the yard, the fence, everything. There were clear footprints near the window and a cigarette butt on the ground that hadn't been there before. The officers said they'd check with nearby houses for cameras, but there weren't any facing that direction. I left that same day and never went back. Weeks later, out of curiosity, I checked the Airbnb listing again. It was still there, still listed, still showing that same cozy little backyard in the photos. But the reviews had changed. A new one, posted just days after I left, said something that made my stomach turn. The guest mentioned someone knocking lightly on the window at night, but assumed it was kids from the neighborhood. There were no kids living anywhere near that road. The nearest houses were half a mile away. I deleted the app after that. I don't travel alone anymore, and if I stay somewhere, I always check the locks twice, tape the curtains shut, and make sure there's nothing near the windows where someone could stand unseen. That trip made me realize something I never thought much about before. When you rent a stranger's property, you don't really know who's been there, who has a spare key, or who's been watching past guests. The place looked normal in the daylight, quiet and safe. But I still remember those footsteps outside the window, the slow sound of breathing, and the feeling that someone had been waiting in that dark yard long before I arrived.